Have you ever imagined a moment in broad daylight, when the sun is blazing high, suddenly turning into a scene as cruel as a trial in hell, a living, breathing young woman, dragged across a dirt yard, treated no different than an animal brought up for sale with a price tag so cheap it could be bought with just 2 silver coins? This isn't some invented tale. It happened out here on the unforgiving frontier. And from that very moment, one man's quiet decision changed everything. Before we step deeper into what happened, don't forget to hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support not only keeps this channel alive, it gives me the strength to keep telling these blood-soaked, tear-stained stories of the Wild West. And I promise you today's story will make your chest tighten with outrage and despair, holding you captive until the very last word. Arizona Territory, late 19th century. The afternoon sun cut across the town of Dry Creek like a sharp blade, slicing through the dusty yard where wagons stood hitched. The smell of horses, cheap whiskey, and sweat hung thick. But heavier still was the tension, the hungry, mean-spirited stares of the men who had formed a circle. In the center stood Jed Crowley, a drunken ranch hand in rumpled clothes, collar stained, hair plastered with sweat. He yanked a rope tied cruelly around the wrists of a young Apache woman, jerking her to her knees and then dragging her back up like a lifeless rag doll. Every tug of that rope bit fresh blood into her raw skin. Crowley's laugh rattled with liquor, jagged and merciless. $2. That's all she's worth. Strong enough to scrub, cook, haul, or do whatever a man pleases. $2 for a whole Apache girl. His words cracked through the air like a whip, each syllable striking harder than the last. The woman was Nayeli. Her long black hair fell over a bruised face, her ragged dress slipping off one shoulder to reveal welts and purple bruises. She tried to rise after being thrown down, her bound hands trembling, palms already scraped raw. Every breath was labored, heavy as stone. Yet she made no sound. Her gaze stayed fixed on the dirt, not out of shame, but because she knew that one wrong look, one glance upward, could unleash a storm of fists and boots. The crowd wasn't blind to her suffering, but they chose to spit tobacco, chuckle, or mutter that she wasn't worth the trouble. Some walked away, others shook their heads. Step by step, word by word, glance by glance, they stripped her of humanity, reducing her to nothing but a cheap commodity. In that moment, despair engulfed Nayeli. Her heart raced, but her spirit was numbed by too many days of cruelty. She believed her life would end in ropes, jeers, and the filth of men's laughter. The only thing left was her breath shallow, quick, proof she was still alive. But at the edge of the circle stood a different presence, a tall, still figure, silent as stone. Caleb Mercer, the man who lived alone in the hills to the north. Sun-darkened face, a scar running from cheekbone to jaw, eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. He had seen too much blood in war, too many lives sold cheap. He had come to Dry Creek for flour, coffee, and new shoes for his horse, but as he watched that girl dragged like cattle, memories he'd buried clawed back like wolves. Jed Crowley's voice still bellowed, $2, who's got the guts, or are you all cowards? The words cracked the silence, then boots scuffed slowly across the hard ground. The crowd shifted aside. Caleb said nothing. He slipped a hand into his pocket, pulled out 2 silver coins, and dropped them into Crowley's filthy palm. The metallic clink rang sharp in the air, cold as a blade. The onlookers held their breath. Crowley grinned, thinking he'd won, but instead of tugging the rope to claim ownership, Caleb drew the knife at his belt. Sunlight flashed on steel. Nayeli's chest seized, certain this was the end, but the blade never touched her skin. It slashed clean through the rope. The bonds fell to the dirt, leaving angry welts burning on her wrists. The yard fell into silence. No laughter, no spitting, just dust swirling in the fading light. Crowley's grin faltered, curses spilling as he stumbled off towards the saloon, already forgetting the life he'd tried to sell. Nayeli looked up, her vision blurred not from tears, but from shock. The man before her hadn't grabbed, hadn't barked commands, hadn't even spoken. Just a nod, and a steady hand at her elbow, guiding her out of the ring of jeers. That feeling despair hardened into fury. Fury dissolving into silence. And from that silence, a hand of deliverance seared itself into every witness. But for Nayeli, it branded her very blood. This wasn't about 2 coins anymore. It was about 2 broken lives crossing paths by chance, opening a chapter neither she nor Caleb had ever dared to imagine. Have you ever stepped into a strange house where the silence was so heavy you could hear your own heartbeat pounding like a drum? For someone who had grown used to ropes cutting into her wrists, to the sneers and the rough hands of men. Even kindness could feel like a trap. That was Nayeli's first night inside the frontier cabin. The trail from Dry Creek to Caleb Mercer's place wasn't long, but for Nayeli, it stretched like forever. On the mule's back, her body shook with every jolt, each time her eyes slid toward the man walking beside her. Her chest clenched tighter. He had cut her free. Yes, led her away from the jeers. But for what? Were those silver coins simply a legal way of owning her? Or was this just another cage? Quieter. Harder to escape when the cabin finally came into view against the ridge. Smoke curling from its stovepipe. Nayeli's fingers dug into the saddle horn. Her instinct screamed, "Don't trust. Don't forget what the rope taught you." Caleb tied off the mule in the small yard, where cottonwoods whispered in the wind. He reached to help her down, careful not to touch her bruises. But the very care in his touch made her wary. Fear didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from what couldn't be read. The cabin door swung open. Inside was bare 1 narrow bed against the wall, a rough table and 2 chairs, a rifle propped in the corner. The smell of wood smoke lingered. To Nayeli, it looked less like shelter and more like another cell waiting to close in. Caleb set flour and coffee on the table, then quietly pulled a bar of soap and a folded cotton shirt from a chest, laying them neatly on the bed. He didn't explain. He only turned back to the stove, stoked the fire, set water to boil. To Nayeli, every move carried 2 faces, a rare act of kindness, or the opening move of some hidden snare. When she saw the soap and shirt, her heart hammered. Did he mean for her to wash, to change? And then, the thought made her hands tremble. But he didn't look back, didn't press, didn't leer. He simply sat down near the stove, tugged his hat low. His voice came rough but steady, as if speaking of splitting wood you can wash. Nayeli froze. It had been too long since anyone had given her a choice. That silence felt both like a gift and a trap. Slowly she stepped to the basin, dipped the cloth, and cleaned the dust and blood from her skin. The hot water stung every cut, but it carried away the filth, too. When she slipped into the oversized cotton shirt, it hung loose, shapeless, but it was clean. And it didn't smell of men. All the while, Caleb never turned his head. He stared into the fire, still as stone. That quiet unsettled her more than a threat would have. Why doesn't he strike? Why doesn't he claim what he paid for? What is he waiting for? She pulled the blanket tight, sat rigid on the edge of the bed, eyes never leaving his broad shoulders. He shifted in his chair once, lowering his hat further as if to give her more space. The cabin filled only with the crackle of burning wood. Night deepened. Every groan of wind through the cracks made her heart leap. She braced for footsteps, for a hand reaching out in the dark. But none came. Only the steady rhythm of Caleb's breathing, slow and even. She didn't sleep. Not really. Her eyes stayed wide, fingers clenched on the blanket, Yet in that endless silence, something unfamiliar seeped in. There were no jeers, no blows, no commands. Just the fire's low hiss and the chair's faint creak when he shifted. And in that, she felt the faintest whisper of something she hadn't known in months, space to breathe. At dawn, light slipped through the cracks in the shutters. Caleb rose first, set the kettle on, laid out a crust of bread and some beans. He didn't bark orders. He only said, plain and rough as always, "Eat something. We'll figure the rest later." Nayeli pulled the shirt tighter around her, shoulders still stiff, eyes wary. But when her fingers touched the bread, her empty stomach answered louder than her doubt. And that morning, when their eyes met across the small cabin for the first time, suspicion still stood between them. Yet in that narrow crack of silence, the first fragile thread of trust slipped through thin as light through a broken shutter. Maybe the hardest part isn't surviving the night it's waking up the next morning and realizing you have to face another day with a stranger. That was Nayeli's feeling in those first days inside Caleb Mercer's cabin. The silence that had shielded her through the dark now stood like a wall between them, making every step, every gesture heavy and awkward. The cabin was small, just one room, no corners to hide in. Each morning, Caleb rose early, stoked the fire, brewed coffee. Nayeli sat rigid on the bed, eyes wide open, not daring to move. She listened to the spoon tapping the pot, to the pop of burning wood, and wondered, should I get up? Should I step into the kitchen? Should I speak her throat closed tight? And she let the silence stretch. Caleb never pushed. He simply set a piece of hard bread and a cup of weak coffee on the table. When she hesitated, perched on the edge of the bed, he said flatly, "Eat. Work takes strength." The word sounded more like habit than command. Nayeli forced herself up, hands trembling as she broke the bread into tiny bites. She wasn't used to being served a portion. In the months before, food had been thrown at her, or snatched in scraps before others took it away. Now, having someone set food down for her without demand confused her more than it comforted her. Day after day, the awkwardness hung in the air. They spoke so little that the chop of Caleb's axe outside or the rustle of cloth at the hearth felt louder than any words. Caleb kept to his chores, splitting wood, checking fences, driving cattle to the patch of grass by the ridge. At first, Nayeli sat curled in the corner of the bed, hands idle. But gradually, she couldn't stand the emptiness in her palms. She began gathering scraps of torn cloth, found needle and thread tucked in a drawer. Her fingers thin, calloused from harsh labor, still remembered the motions. She sat by the fire and mended the tear in Caleb's old coat, stitches neat and even. When Caleb returned and saw the fresh seams, he paused, then gave a single nod. For Nayeli, that nod was proof she was no longer invisible. One afternoon, when Caleb carried water back from the creek, he opened the door to the smell of beans simmering over the fire. Nayeli had lit the stove herself, cooked without being asked. He sat, tasted a spoonful, then muttered, "Not bad." Just 2 words, but they sent heat to her cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken praise to her. Still, the strangeness clung to every corner. Each time Caleb walked past, she shrank back like brushing against flame. Each time he placed something near her, her breath stopped short, heart thudding. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because her body didn't yet know how to exist in a space where a man's hand didn't mean pain. For Caleb, it was awkward in his own home. He wasn't used to another presence moving about his cabin. The folded coat on his chair, the soft hum of a woman's voice as she rinsed a pan, it unsettled him. He wanted to say something, but the words stayed locked in his throat, escaping only in brief, plain sentences. Nights were heavier still. Nayeli lay stiff on the bed, back to the wall, eyes wide, listening to the faint creak of Caleb's chair by the stove. He never approached, never touched the blanket. But that distance itself kept her on edge. If not tonight, will it be tomorrow? Or next week? His silence hung like both promise and threat. And yet, the first fragile shoots of trust began to push through. One morning, when Caleb had gone early to the corral, Nayeli swept the floor, folded the bedding, washed the tin plates. When he returned, the room was neater than before. He said nothing, only dropped the bundle of firewood by the wall and sat down. But in the glance he gave, there was a flicker of warmth. Those first days. The cabin was no longer only Caleb's shelter. It became a stage where two strangers moved carefully, clumsy in their silence, yet unwilling to turn away. And from those small, hesitant steps, mending a coat, sharing a meal, tidying a room, something fragile began to take root. Not yet trust, not yet belonging, but the rhythm of two lives brushing against one another, searching for ground to stand on. Some fears can come alive with just a smell, a laugh, or the sight of a familiar street. For Nayeli, that shadow was the town of Dry Creek. She had once been dragged into its dusty yard, bound and auctioned like livestock. So when Caleb said they had to return for flour, coffee, salt, and other supplies, her whole body weakened. But survival meant no choice. This time, though, he didn't tell her to trail behind. His words were plain: "You'll walk beside me." The trail into Dry Creek stretched long, dust rising under the hooves. Caleb limped but walked steady, his presence like a wall at her side. Each time Nayeli pulled her shawl tighter. He shifted his horse closer to the mule, shielding her without a word. The town appeared under the hard noon sun, the clatter of wagons, voices bargaining, the sour reek of whiskey spilling from the saloon. Nayeli lowered her gaze, hands white-knuckled around the shawl. She felt the stares, heard the whispers, the half-laughs, as sharp as blades reopening an old wound. Caleb stepped down first and held out his hand. Shame knotted her stomach, but when she looked up, his eyes held no impatience, only quiet expectation. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his, letting him steady her. Then she stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Those on the boardwalk blinked, no longer seeing a girl dragged on a rope, but a woman standing at a man's side. Inside the general store, the air smelled of cloth and flour. The shopkeeper, a round old man behind spectacles, looked up and froze, then bent quickly over his ledger. Caleb's voice cut steady: flour, coffee, salt, cloth blue if you've got it, and boots, women's size 6. Nayeli froze. He had noticed her bare feet, guessed her size with a single glance. The thought made her chest tighten shame, and something else tangled deep inside. The shopkeeper shuffled to fill the order. Then the door banged open. Boots hit the floorboards heavy, and that voice reeking of whiskey, mocking, slid into the room. "Well, I'll be. Thought I'd gotten rid of that burden. Turns out you dragged it home. Mercer. It was Jed Crowley. The man who had once held the rope at her wrists now sneered at her again, face red with drink. Didn't figure you for a fool. $2 wasted. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." Nayeli froze, breath locking in her chest. The smell of whiskey, that twisted grin, every lash of memory flared alive. Her knees nearly buckled. Caleb stepped forward, placing his body square between her and Crowley. He didn't raise his voice, didn't draw steel. His shoulders alone were enough. His words came low, flat. "You took your money. That was the end of it." "Leave it there." Crowley spat on the floorboards, lip curled. "She'll ruin you. You'll regret it." Caleb's eyes didn't shift. His voice dropped colder. "Then it'll be my regret, not yours." The room tightened, heavy as iron in a forge. The shopkeeper busied himself loudly with jars on a shelf, hands shaking. Nayeli clutched her shawl, heart thundering, but beneath the panic came something she had never felt before. Someone was standing in the path of her fear. Crowley muttered curses and staggered back through the door, leaving the stench of liquor behind. The silence that followed was thick, but it was relief. Caleb laid coins on the counter, gathered the bundle of goods. Then he leaned slightly towards Nayeli, his voice for her alone. "You're safe with me. They can look, but they can't touch." The words weren't sweet, weren't gentle, but they landed like a vow. Nayeli swallowed hard, hands trembling, but her spine straightened. When they left Dry Creek, eyes still followed them. Yet this time, Nayeli sat taller on the mule. The shawl wasn't a shield of shame, it was a cloak of dignity. Caleb rode close, as steady as a stone wall, on the long ride back. The weight of humiliation from that trading yard began to shift. In the sack lay a bolt of blue cloth and new boots. Small things, but more than goods, they were signs that her worth had been reclaimed, and in her heart. Fury no longer turned inward at her own helplessness. It turned outward, against the cruelty that had tried to crush her. There are frontier nights when the rain doesn't just hammer the roof, it shakes loose every scar buried in a person's mind. That night, the clouds rolled heavy, wind howled hard, and the sky split open. Rain beat down on Caleb's cabin, the roof groaning under the storm. For Nayeli, the sound wasn't only rain, it was footsteps. It was the lash of rope. It was Crowley's drunken laughter echoing in her head. She jolted awake, breath sharp, sweat cold on her skin though the air outside was chilled. In her dream she'd felt the rope bite again, heard the jeers, tasted helplessness. Now awake, the dark inside the cabin felt just as thick as the nightmare. Caleb, sitting by the stove where the fire had burned low, heard the rustle. He looked up to see Nayeli curled tight, hands trembling against the blanket. He didn't rush to her. He simply spoke, his voice low and steady. "You all right?" The rasp of his words anchored her. She couldn't answer, her throat locked, but she could see he was still in the chair, keeping distance, not crowding her. The rain pounded harder. Lightning flashed through the shutters. Caleb rose slowly, added wood to the stove, and the flames flared, casting light over his scarred face and steady eyes. His voice came again, rough but certain. "No one touches you. Not here." Nayeli clutched the blanket tighter, but her shaking eased. It wasn't a flowery promise, just plain truth, and truth was enough for her to draw a longer breath. The nightmares didn't end that week, but each time they came, Caleb became her anchor. When she gasped awake, he never rushed in, never reached for her. From the chair by the fire, his voice was always the same. "You're safe now." And somehow, those words steadied her more than an embrace could have. One stormy night, thunder shook the shutters loose. Nayeli bolted upright, a cry caught in her throat. This time, Caleb rose from the chair and stepped closer. He didn't loom, only stopped near the bed and asked quietly, "You want me to stay?" Her eyes glistened, her hand wavered, then slowly reached out to his rough palm. Her voice trembled. "Stay." He sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders broad against the firelight. He didn't pull her close, didn't lay claim. He only rested his hand lightly on the blanket at her waist, firm enough to be felt, gentle enough to let her choose. Her breathing slowed, sinking to his steady rhythm. In the hush, she tipped her forehead against his shoulder. Caleb lowered his head, brushing his lips against her hair, no more than a whisper of a touch. Not demand, not hunger, but the first flicker of trust. They stayed that way a long while. The storm still raged outside, But inside the cabin, the sound no longer belonged to ropes and jeers. It belonged to two heartbeats settling into the same pace. When she finally drifted into sleep, her breath even. Caleb kept his seat beside her. He watched the fire glow low, thought of the 2 coins he'd spent, of the years he'd lived alone on the ridge. None of that had given him the quiet he felt now. This wasn't about a purchase. It was about choosing to stay, and about her choosing to let him. That night, they were no longer strangers bound by a cruel bargain. They were 2 scarred souls finding a fragile closeness, built not on debt, but on respect. And from then on, every storm that rolled across the ridge no longer brought only nightmares. Sometimes, it carried a softer reminder that someone would keep watch, that someone would stay. That afternoon, the sky was clear, wind sweeping dust across the fence line. Caleb was out back, limping but steady as he tied off the cattle. Nayeli carried water from the well, moving slow, her long hair falling loose over shoulders that no longer looked as hollow as before. It felt almost like peace until the sound of hooves broke the air, the jingle of tack cutting through the breeze. Caleb looked up, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. 2 riders approached, dust rising around them. The first was a familiar shape, Jed Crowley, face red with drink, mouth curled into a mean grin. Beside him rode another man, coat worn thin, a dull deputy's badge pinned to his vest, Tom Harlan. Nayeli froze. The bucket slipped from her hands, water spilling across the dirt. Her chest clenched like a rope had been thrown over her again, dragging her back into the trading yard at Dry Creek, into jeers and the sting of shame. Crowley's gaze latched onto her, then snapped toward Caleb. His voice was sharp. Soaked in whiskey, Mercer. You owe me. That woman ain't yours to take. Give her back, or give me more money. Deputy Harlan reined his horse slow. Not cruel like Crowley, but cautious. Official. His voice carried weight, though it wavered. There have been complaints in town. Folks saying a woman's being kept here against her will. I need to hear it from her mouth, whether she's here by choice or not. The air went heavy as iron. Nayeli's throat locked tight, words trapped behind fear. Memories crowded her, the rope biting her wrists, the drunken laughter, the helpless nights. Crowley nudged his horse forward, eyes leering, and the world tilted back towards nightmare. Caleb stepped up, placing himself squarely between her and the riders. His hand hovered near his belt but didn't draw. His stance alone was weapon enough. His voice came low, steady as stone, Harlan. Hear me clear. Crowley took his money. That was the end of it. There's no debt left. Crowley spat into the dust, rage spilling money or not. She was mine first. I'll take her back, if I please. Nayeli trembled, clutching her dress. But then, she looked at Caleb's back, straight, unyielding, holding ground against both men. And something flared inside her. She remembered the nights he kept the fire burning, the quiet words, "You're safe here." The choice she had never dared make before rose to her lips. She drew a deep breath. Her voice cracked but rang firm. I stay here, because I choose. The words cut like a blade through the silence. Not a whisper. Not a plea, an open declaration. Sharp as steel in the afternoon air. Harlan's eyes searched her face. Her hand still shook, but her gaze didn't fall. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. If that's what she says, then that's what I'll stand on, Crowley bellowed. Lies, she's forced to say that I'll drag her back. But Caleb's stare burned cold as hammered iron. He stepped forward half a pace, voice dropping harder. Try it. Crowley. But know this, no one takes her while I'm standing here. The moment crackled, heavy as thunder before the break. Crowley's lips twisted, curses spilling. But his nerve faltered. He jerked the reins. yanked his horse around, and stormed off in a haze of dust. Harlan lingered a beat, hat shadowing his eyes. His tone softened as he turned his horse. Look after each other. Don't let the talk bury you. Then he followed Crowley down the trail, leaving the yard in silence. Nayeli realized her fists were clenched so tight her knuckles ached. She let go, gasping a breath like breaking free of a noose. Caleb turned toward her, eyes still hard from the standoff, but gentled when they found hers. He didn't speak, only gave a single nod, a vow unspoken. No one will take you from here. Something in her broke loose. She stepped forward, pressing her forehead against his chest, hearing the steady drum of his heart. He didn't pull her in, didn't smother her. He simply stood solid, letting her lean until her breath came even again. That moment marked a turn. Her trust was no longer a fragile seedling, no longer something borrowed from his watchful silence. It had roots, now roots she had planted herself, spoken aloud before men who would have stripped her voice away. The sun sank low behind the ridge, painting the cabin in gold. No gunfire, no bloodshed, just a truth declared she was not property. She was a woman who chose where she belonged. After the standoff with Crowley, Caleb knew words alone weren't enough. Out here, rumors could kill as fast as a bullet. Without something written down, any man could ride back and claim Nayeli was being held against her will. Caleb wasn't willing to leave that door open. So one clear morning, as he tightened the cinch on his horse and packed a sack of provisions, he said simply, "We're riding to Silver Rock. Time to put it on paper." The county seat lay 2 hours down the trail. Dust rose around them as they rode side by side in silence. Nayeli kept her shawl wrapped tight, but her posture was different now. She sat straighter, no longer a shadow shrinking into itself, but a woman looking forward to a choice that mattered. Silver Rock was busier than Dry Creek wagons clogging the street, children darting between horses, merchants shouting deals over crates of goods. Caleb led them straight to the courthouse, a squat wooden building that smelled of ink and dust. Behind the counter, a clerk with round spectacles looked up, studying them with a skeptical eye. Caleb laid his hand on the counter, voice firm as stone. "This woman lives with me, but she stays because she chooses. I want it written down." The clerk blinked, then dipped his pen into ink. On the page, in slanted, heavy script, he wrote, "The woman Nayeli declares of her own free will that she resides with Caleb Mercer." He slid the paper across. Caleb signed clean and strong, then handed the pen to Nayeli. Her hand trembled. She hadn't written her name in years. But slowly, carefully, she traced the letters, Nayeli. The ink bled slightly into the fibers, but it was clear. When she set the pen down, relief washed through her chest. For the first time in years, her name wasn't tied to ownership, it was tied to choice, outside. Caleb didn't waste words. He went straight into the general store and asked the keeper, "Got rings?" The man looked surprised, then brought out a small wooden box. Inside lay plain bands of brass and silver. Caleb picked one simple silver band without fuss, dropped coins on the counter, then turned to Nayeli. On the boardwalk, with sunlight glaring off wagon wheels and voices buzzing around them, Caleb set the ring in her palm. His words were plain, his tone rough but clear. "Stay with me for good. Be my wife, but as my equal." Nayeli stared at the ring, then at him. Memories flashed, rope biting her skin. Crowley's sneer, the weight of $2 silver, and then his words, "as my equal." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "Yes, as your equal." A rare smile touched his lips. He slid the ring onto her finger, his scarred hand surprisingly gentle. The cold band warmed quickly against her skin. In that moment, there was no debt, no bargain, only a beginning. Weeks later, they returned to Silver Rock, this time to stand before the preacher in the plain wooden church. Candles flickered, beeswax smoke hanging in the air, pews filled with curious faces. The preacher's voice carried solemn weight. "Do you take this woman freely, to be your wife, before God and this community?" "For as long as you both shall live," Caleb answered without hesitation. "I do." The preacher turned to Nayeli. "Do you take this man freely, to be your husband, before God and this community?" "For as long as you both shall live," Nayeli lifted her head. Voice firm, "I do." Caleb slid the ring once more onto her finger, this time before witnesses. Whispers stirred in the pews, doubt lingering in some eyes. But others softened. Seeing the truth, this was no forced vow, no bargain struck. It was choice, spoken aloud in the house of God, after the ceremony. They shared a slice of pie at the cafe, sitting side by side like any other couple. The town might still whisper, but the law, the church, and their own hearts had sealed what no man could undo. On the ride home, the late sun painted the ridge gold. At the cabin, Nayeli laid her hand now bearing a silver ring on the rough-hewn table. She looked at Caleb and said, "Quiet but sure, this is our home." Caleb nodded once, voice steady ours. And in that moment, trust was no longer fragile, no longer borrowed from silence or guarded by fear. It was rooted deep, strong as the logs of the cabin itself. A trust witnessed by the law, blessed by the church, but most of all, bound in the hearts of two people who had chosen each other. Winter's grip finally loosened, giving way to a spring that spread bright across Silver Rock country. Snowmelt filled the creeks, and the hard earth softened enough to send up green shoots, and just like the land itself. The small cabin on the ridge changed as well, no longer a lonely shelter, but a home echoing with laughter. Each morning, as sunlight broke through the cottonwoods, Nayeli stepped into the garden. Her hands, once scarred by rope, pressed deep into soft earth, planting beans, squash, and corn. Caleb often stood on the porch, leaning slightly on his bad leg, watching her bend over the rows. To his eyes, every motion she made was proof of renewal. The woman once sold for $2 was now sowing seeds as the rightful mistress of the land. Inside the cabin, the fire never went out. The smell of beans and cornbread mingled with Nayeli's soft laughter as she tested a new recipe. Caleb was still a man of few words, but every so often he would mutter a simple compliment, "That's good," and those words alone were enough to light her face with joy. At first, neighbors still whispered. Some said, "It's just pity. He bought her, and now plays husband." Others muttered, "It won't last." But time itself gave the answer. Each time folks saw Nayeli and Caleb walking through town, shoulder to shoulder, steady in their steps, the gossip lost its teeth. She wasn't cowering behind him anymore. She chose cloth, paid for goods, greeted passers-by as his equal. In Silver Rock, attitudes shifted. The baker's wife, who once whispered behind her back, now nodded kindly and slipped an extra slice of cake into Nayeli's basket. Deputy Tom Harlan, who had once ridden out to question her will, now tipped his hat whenever their paths crossed. Most important, inside the cabin itself. Peace had taken root. Evenings found them side by side on the porch, watching the sun settle red over the ridge. Caleb's rough hand resting over Nayeli's was not a claim of ownership, but of companionship. She leaned into his shoulder, calm in her gaze. No words were needed. They both knew that loneliness had been defeated. Friends, this isn't just a story of love, it's a story of redemption. Caleb, the scarred veteran who once lived alone with ghosts, opened his heart and found family. Nayeli, once treated as nothing more than a possession, now stood as Nayeli Mercer, wife and equal, her name no longer a mark of shame, but of dignity. The question that remains is, where do they go from here? A garden is only beginning, a family just forming. Will they grow the land into a true farm? With rows of crops and cattle in the pasture, will they dream of children, to fill the cabin with young laughter? What is certain is this: the foundation is strong. Trust is no longer a fragile thread, but a tree taking root. Each day lived together proves the whispers wrong, and as spring stretches across the desert, their happiness spreads with it, reminding us all that love and justice can bloom even on the harshest frontier. So, dear listeners, if this tale has touched you, let your support be known. Leave a word of encouragement. What would you hope for Caleb and Nayeli? Next more land tilled and harvested, the laughter of children, or simply the quiet life they've built, guarded, and cherished? Because frontier stories are more than passing tales. They remind us that even in loss and hardship, people can choose again. They can build family, home, and hope on equal ground, with love as the mortar. Caleb and Nayeli Mercer stand as living proof of that truth.